Hello and welcome to the Powered by Rock podcast, where I'm going to be speaking with a veritable legend of punk rock music and rock music over the last 30 years or so, Marko DeSantis. Marko has played in such bands as Sugarcult, Popsicko, a short stint in the Ataris, and was a member of one of my personal favorite bands of all time, Bad Astronaut. Now Marko teaches music and DJs as well as helps promote bands. His life is intertwined with the California rock scene of the 90s and over the years in so many ways, and I can't wait to hear some incredible stories right after this. You're listening to the Powered by Rock podcast with your host, Isaac Kuhlman. The Powered by Rock podcast was created to help showcase some of the best rock musicians in the world and to pass on to future generations the rock music that has inspired rock fans around the world for decades. We want listeners to be able to hear great stories and life experiences directly from their favorite artists, as well as dig deeper into music theory and talk rock like no other show you've ever heard. This isn't about looking cool, it's about getting real and having a great time. Without further ado, let's start the show. Hello and welcome to the Powered by Rock podcast. I am actually pretty stoked for today's guest because having people like Marko DeSantis on the show is exactly why I started this podcast in the first place. Marko has been ingrained in the punk scene and rock scene in California for the last 30 years or so. And I figured it would be great to have a first-hand account of some of the coolest stories straight from one of the sources. Marko has been a member of some very well-known bands, but he's also really good friends with bands that are household names as well. So let's get started. Marko, welcome to the show.
Hey man, thanks for having me, Isaac.
Yeah. Great to have you here. So I think it's probably fair to say that people might not instantly recognize your name. A lot of people grew up, but a lot of people who grew up on punk in the 90s would recognize music you made or know the bands that you kind of came up and grew up with. I think most people who have listened to rock music in the past 20 years would probably recognize songs like Bouncing Off the Walls, She's the Blade, and Memory by Sugarcult as well. So, I kind of want to start with the Sugarcult band and kind of work around the timelines, kind of like, a Quentin Tarantino movie or something like that. But let's get some insights here. So I think a lot of people always make the assumption that Sugarcult was a pop punk band. And you've been, I wouldn't say adamant, but repeatedly mentioned that you guys weren't really a punk band at all. You were more of just a pop rock band, right? So I think, you and I actually had it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of those weird things. Like, I think Sugarcult, we kind of liked being, we appreciated any love we could get from anyone. Anytime someone would invite us to a party, we would definitely show up and, drink as much free beer as we could. But, we had this kind of lone wolf vibe about us where not because we thought we were better than anybody else or anything like that. If anything, it was probably an inferiority complex. Yeah. But we just sort of had our own thing where we're like, we kind of just do our thing. We don't really want to have this, like, we never really subscribed to like the sort of like tribal kind of group think, cliquey vibe of that tends to happen in a lot of music when you end up sort of like getting attached to any one particular genre. And I think that's just a natural thing. All the guys in our band, you couldn't have four more different individuals. If you look at Sugarcult individually, you would never even it would blow your mind that we're even in the same band with each other. We all like such different things and come from such different backgrounds musically. But to me, that's what's fun about the idea of a band is you don't just get this echo chamber of like four dudes that are all 100% just carbon copies of each other, but just happen to play different instruments. You get like that interesting, I mean, you're shooting for the band to be bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think you get that more when you have an eclectic, diverse cross-section of people coming together with the one thing in common is to like make the songs as awesome as they can possibly be. Yeah. And then if they turn out to be punk songs, they turn out to be ballads, they turn out to be rock, mid-tempo, whatever it is. But you're not like, your eyes aren't on the prize of like, we have to sound like Blink 182. It's not like that. We wanted to do our own thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you and I had a bit of an Instagram chat about Cheap Trick, who was an absolute powerhouse of what I would call pop rock back in the 70s and 80s, a band that you kind of either loved or completely got ignored for some reason. So I think that was kind of like a very, I think when you started posting about the stuff with Cheap Trick, I was like, man, you know what? Cheap Trick is actually a good example of another band that never fit anybody's mold of what rock and roll was. And I think you guys have a lot more in common with like a Cheap Trick or maybe 30 Seconds to Mars, kind of like that LA rock style versus like a pop punk rock band or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I understand the purpose of having categories and all that kind of stuff, but I just, and I know this sounds probably kind of glib, but I'm very like romantic about the conceit that art is supposed to be creative, and art is supposed to stand, is not supposed to be cooperative. Art is supposed to do its thing and kind of run wild, and doesn't mean it has to be like artsy for the sake of being artsy. You can still write like 3-minute pop songs about girls, but like within that, you don't have to be tethered to these like, for us, it was just simple. Like, okay, the limitations we imposed on ourselves was like music that can be made with 2 guitars, a bass, and a drum kit, and some vocals, And so we didn't incorporate, like we didn't have a lot of keyboards. We didn't really have a lot of samples or anything like that. Not because we don't love that music, because we do, but like it was just, that was the art experiment, and then we had these like weird little rules, and I got the idea from like, I love Jack White. I love the White Stripes. I love how he kind of imposed this like, okay, in the White Stripes, it was like drums, guitar, vocals, red, black, white. That's it, go, and very primal. And you get so much cool art with limited, a limited set of crayons in the box. The Ramones, another great example, where it's just like, here's the thing. This is how your hair is going to look. This is what you're going to wear. And this is how we're going to play. Go. 1, 2, 3, 4, And so we kind of like that. Like we had these weird little things, like we wouldn't, in our band, we had like a no blue jeans and no shorts allowed on stage. So if you see any picture of Sugarcult playing the Warped Tour, you're never going to see a picture of us like wearing shorts or like chilling out, wearing a pair of comfortable blue jeans. We always had this like almost military, like ideal, where it was like, you want to suit up to play the show. Doesn't mean you're going to like, we're not going to take it to the level of like Slipknot and have like masks and stuff like that.
And you weren't glam rock or anything like that, where you're wearing like tights.
Not totally, but like we respected an element of glam rock in that there was a showmanship and a sort of separation from just like, how you rolled out of bed in the morning. Because I think some of that, that it was just something about like, hey, let's take this music to town, and the bands we thought were cool growing up, I think a lot of that has an influence on you. And anyways, blah, blah, blah. But I do appreciate the Cheap Trick comparison. And I think it's appropriate because like Cheap Trick had like 2 good looking guys and 2 dorky guys. And our band had 2 good looking guys and 2 dorky guys. I would consider myself one of the dorky guys.
I was gonna say, who's the good-looking guy? So the other one, who's like the ugly guys.
That would be Tim and Aaron. Okay, Tim and Aaron. And then me and the drummer were the weirdos. Okay, so and then you had like songs that everybody knows, like "I Want You to Want Me," "Surrender," maybe like But then there's so much more to their catalog. If you get into Cheap Trick and listen to their music, and you realize there's so much more than like the hits you hear on the radio. Well, it's the same thing with Sugarcult. Most people know "Bouncing Off the Walls," "Memories," "Stuck in America," "Pretty Girl," but then there's all these other songs that you can check out. A lot of people like retroactively have discovered our 3rd record, "Lights Out," which they assumed that they didn't hear because it didn't have like a giant hit on it and it didn't get a really big push. Well, that was for no fault of the record's own or for our band's own. It was because our record company we were on had all this drama that happened to it. But in my opinion, I always thought that record was really like, we were so proud of that record. And we're so excited about that record. It just never really got to deliver on its full promise. It kind of got its life cut short a little bit. So a lot of fans have gone back and maybe they assumed it wasn't a good record, or because they didn't hear about it that much. And they go back and listen to it and they're like, holy shit, this might be your best record, So it's kind of fun,
Yeah,
and
one of those
obviously
bands that. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, but I was just going to say, obviously, like you're so.
You have to cut me off, or I'll keep on going forever.
I was saying, like you obviously have to do you're doing the 20th anniversary of Start Static, the first album, but and you got an anniversary edition of that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But yeah, when you go into the 2nd and 3rd album, there are songs that are what I would consider a bit darker, a little bit moodier than the first album. The first album does have that kind of brighter sound to it than probably the 2nd and 3rd albums. So let's talk about Start Static and the 20th anniversary, and we can talk about the sound of the 2nd and 3rd albums as well.
Yeah. I mean, well, here, let me see if I can grab it here. My little studio here. I've got it right here. If anybody's watching this, this is the 20-year anniversary. I'm not sure if I think the vinyl might be sold out, but you can still like access it on like streaming and stuff because there's a few cool little bonus tracks we kind of brought out of the vaults. Say I'm Sorry, which was a demo, probably the demo that got us the record deal that enabled us to make this record. And then our cover of an Elvis Costello song called No Action, and then a live version of Bouncing Off the Walls. And actually on Spotify and Apple Music and on all the streaming platforms, you can also access another bonus track, which is a live version of Stuck in America, nice. Which is just kind of cool. But, you know, it's for people who like to collect vinyl. It's kind of fun because it's it's got the wraparound artwork and, you know, it has some different stuff on the inside. And then there's like, you know, we have a clear vinyl, and I wrote some liner notes that are sort of nerdy and cool to read if you're a fan. It tells you all about what was going on when we were making the record. And then this is cool. So it's clear vinyl. And then there's also one, it's funny, they asked us, they're like, if you could have 2 colors of vinyl, what would you choose? And we chose clear and we chose black vinyl. And they're like, don't you want a color? Like splatter or something? We're like, I feel like black vinyl is a color now because everybody does colored vinyl. Yeah. And I just love the idea of like, you know, having something that just looks the same as like a Beatles record or a Rolling Stones record or like an Elvis record. Like it's like the classic black vinyl. There's something about that to me is just super cool.
Oh yeah, I grew up on.
That's so we're excited about that. 20 years goes by quick, man.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, I was just thinking like Bouncing Off the Wall. Yeah, I feel like I just remember that coming out like 7, 8, 10 years ago, and I'm like, oh my god, that was 2001 or whatever. I was like, oh my, wow, I'm old.
Tell me about it, man. It sneaks up on you, but it's cool. You know, it's cool.
Yeah. Also,
as my friend likes to say. My buddy Joe Sib, who's a stand-up comedian, but also is, you know, a big dude in the music business. He owns a label called Side One Dummy. He has a great quote. He says, "He's getting old is what happens when you don't die." So I suppose it's a better option. You know what I mean? So
exactly. Yeah, and so a little cool story that I read in some of the notes about Sugarcult a lot, but I don't hear people talking about, and I wanted to check in with you, is that you actually met you met Sugarcult at a Superdrag concert, and that's how you kind of got into the band. That band was actually one of my freaking favorite bands in high school, and Sucked Out was probably still one of my favorite 100, you know, top 100 songs of all time. Is that story true? And why did you guys go to a Superdrag concert?
Okay, well, first of all, yeah, Superdrag, such a great band, another great, like, kind of underrated, maybe misunderstood band of their era. But like, I mean, that record, like, Regretfully Yours, and the one after it, you know, Head Trip in Every Key, and actually the one in the Valley of the Dying Stars, the one after it, like, that band is so important. You know, I feel like you don't have Sugarcult without Superdrag, and to be honest, you probably don't have the Foo Fighters without Superdrag either. It's like they're people, you know, forget how much of an impact that band had on so many other bands that became much bigger.
Yep.
Probably the reason why the Foos used Nick Raskulinecz as their producer for some of their records was because of In the Valley of the Dying Stars, you know. And obviously Rob Cavallo did the record before, and he had done Green Day records and all kinds of stuff. No, actually, sorry, not Rob Cavallo. I think it was Jerry Finn who did Head Trip in Every Key. And Jerry Finn produced also, he mixed Green Day's records, but he produced Blink-182. Anyway, nerdy stuff here that people are listening.
I know that people are going to start Googling shit right now as we're talking.
Google it, man. It's fun. But no, it's fun to geek out on shit like that.
Yeah.
But so Superdrag coming through Santa Barbara, which is our hometown. They were coming through Santa Barbara on their Head Trip in Every Key tour way back when, and I believe it was 99. And I was playing bass in some local band with just some friends of mine, and we got the call from our friend who was like in charge of booking bands, and she was like, yo, the band Superdrag's coming through town. They don't have an opening band, but so they want to see if like we can get a couple local bands to just be like what they call local support. So, you know, the hope is that you're going to bring all your friends to come see you play. So we're like, yeah, sure, we'll do it. I love Superdrag. It'll get us into the show for free, you know? And then I get there to play, and there's this other band taking the stage, and I knew everybody in town. And Santa Barbara's a pretty small town. And I knew everyone in all the local bands. And I see these guys that I'd never seen before, And I just assumed maybe they were like a touring band that was like out opening for Superdrag, or maybe a band from another town that came in to play the show.
Yeah.
They looked pretty cool, and they got up and played, and there was nobody there. But I watched their set. I just sort of stood out there just because I had nothing else to do and watched them. And I was like, dude, these guys are great, man. These songs are really good. They seem like they're pretty ramshackle, like it's pretty like, you know, inexperienced and raw. But like you could tell that the songs were good. And I got to say, like Tim, right out of the gates, our lead singer, Tim Pagnotta, he just had that, like, what I like to call it, undefinable something. He had that sort of star quality, that sort of je ne sais quoi, where you're just like, you don't know how to explain it, but you know it when you see it.
For sure.
You feel me?
Yeah.
He has that thing, and you just like, I was just, there's something about this guy. He's got this, like, he looks like he's supposed to, he looks like he's born to do this. Like he's up there. He looks like he owns the place. He's presenting it as though he's the headlining band that's got a major label record deal behind him. So I went up to him afterwards, and I was like, dude, what's going on? I'm Marco. What's, you know, one of the bands, you know, who are you guys? And he's like, oh, dude, my name's Tim. He's like, that was actually our first show ever. We're just like some kids that go to the community college here. Wow. And we just like threw this thing together because we got an opportunity to, like, you know, someone said, hey, they needed local support for the show. And he was a Superdrag fan. So he, you know, he kind of like, they just kind of cobbled it together. They'd been jamming together. And I was like, dude, that's insane. You guys are so good. And we just kind of like exchanged numbers. And he actually had come up to me and acknowledged, like, he liked what I was wearing, because I sort of dressed different than all the other guys in my band. I had like a suit jacket on, and just, I looked more like the way his band was dressed, you know? Yeah. And so we had this weird sort of mutual kind of admiration and exchange numbers. And then it was just kind of like, just call them up. I almost felt like you were like when you first start dating a girl, you know, you're like talking on the phone for hours and making each other.
I feel like it's harder to talk to an adult man than it is to talk to a woman on a phone.
It's weird. Like, yeah, because there's that weird, like, oh, we'll have a beer together. But it was like, we talk on the phone and we just nerding out about music and just about kind of bonding over things we thought were cool and things we thought were lame. And, you know, kind of talking about Superdrag, talking about the local scene in our town. And then it just kind of came to that weird, awkward conclusion where it was like, dude, why are we not playing in a band together? You know? And I was like, dude, it's too bad you guys already have a guy playing bass, because I'd love to play bass. And I mean, I've told this story a million times. And then eventually he's like, yeah, okay, whatever. And then he calls me up one day and he's like, leaves a message, a voicemail. And he's just like, I don't know what you're doing, but, you know, give me a call. I have an idea. And I call him. He's like, so I feel like this band is supposed to have another guitar player, because there's so many cool little parts to these songs, but I can't play them while I'm singing and, you know, playing at the same time. And so they'd done a couple shows, and I think he realized that the band wasn't meant to be a trio. And so he asked me, he's like, I don't think, you know, I don't think our bass player is going to leave anytime soon, but would you want to try playing guitar? And I was like, sure, dude, you know, go for it. Like, I wasn't really a guitar player. Like, that's not what I really I started out on guitar incidentally, but I had switched to bass when I was a teenager and kind of played bass for several years. And so I was like, at the time I was kind of just looking for a change, and I wasn't really happy where I had landed. And so it was like just the right novelty, like where it was like, hey, guitar, that sounds like fun. And this guy's cool, and I like the band, and I got in there with them, and I really had like low expectations. Like, I just thought we'd just have some fun after school and work and just be a local band for a little while until I figured out what was next. Yep. And all of a sudden, a couple of years, you know, fast forward 2 years later, we were making our first record, got on the Warped Tour, started touring, and then it was just like this like 10-year plus whirlwind of nonstop activity. And here we are 20 years later talking about it. You know? Yeah.
And I mean, it wasn't like your first rodeo or anything. Like, you had actually been in Popsicko, which was a pretty big band coming up through Santa Barbara at the time. You guys were basically slated to be one of these bands that, you know, that Sugarcult ended up being, or could have been another band that you could have played with for years and years and years. But obviously that band was cut short due to the death of the lead singer, Keith. But let me talk to you.
I appreciate how you did your homework. I'll show you a little artifact here. Popsicko. It's kind of funny that Popsicko, which was my band, and you know, before Sugarcult, we were like the local band, and actually this is at the same venue it just was under a different name back then, same address, same venue in Santa Barbara as the place where we opened for Superdrag.
Nice.
Where me and Tim met.
Nice.
So there's something about this address. I think there's like a like brewery there now, but like about 110 Santa Barbara Street, my band Popsicko opened for this band called Green Day that had just put out their album Dookie.
Yeah.
So they just like Green Day was just popping up and about to become like on the radio and blow up and become the legends that they are today. That was like day one of Green Day.
And you actually headlined for Reissue as well.
That's right. We also did that. So we get to play with Green Day and Weezer. And this last summer, I went and saw Green Day and Weezer play Dodger Stadium. And I was like, dude, I've played like clubs with both of those bands.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that it's a crazy thing that I had this band that like I built from the ground up, and we had gotten like really close to some success. And then we made a record on our own, Off to a Bad Start, which actually is going to get re-released on vinyl this year. So I'm super excited about that. A label called Big Stir Records is going to put it out, Off to a Bad Start by Popsicko. And there's a few songs you can stream from Popsicko on like, you know, whatever, on whatever streaming platform you guys do, Spotify or whatever. And but it's a trip because that was kind of the band that was like the would have been, should have been one where you're like, oh, this is going to happen. I can just taste it. It feels crazy. You know, you're never ready for it. It felt like all the stars were aligning, and then it just didn't work. And our singer, unfortunately, you know, died young, and that was kind of the end of that. And then there was a few years of just kind of in the wilderness where I had some other bands that kind of did this, that, and the other. I did some hired gun stuff where I'd play like in punk bands and do some regional touring, and nothing really connected to the point where it felt like it was going to like take root, you know, and really like feel like, okay, this is the new thing. This is a new beginning. And so there's a lot of dead ends. And honestly, like, you know, just when I was probably starting to think about like just kind of hanging it up and just going, well, I gave rock and roll a try. That's when I met Tim. And that's when I joined Sugarcult in their like first few months of existence. And that's when we like, just like, you know, I had that attitude where Tim, it was his first band ever. Aaron, our bass player, it was his first band ever. Me, it was like I had been playing in bands since I was 13 or 14 years old, you know, and I had been
going
an
all the way
early
back to the
bloomer,
Lost Kittens,
and then even further back, you know, Lost Kittens wasn't even the first. I had all these bands from when I was just a kid, and then, you know, it looked like, and then by the time we got to Popsicko, it was like, oh man, there it is, and then that didn't work. So it was like I started out as the early, like before everybody else, and I ended up having to wait for everybody else to have their careers, and then my band made it finally. So Sugarcult was kind of the like Hail Mary at the end of a long, long stretch of just like, you know, nonstop rock, you know, at a local level. And I was so happy that, you know, once we started to sort of like take off, I just had this attitude where it was like, you guys, I know what it feels like to have a band that starts to get some action and then falls apart or whatever. Like, we got to do this right. We got to go all out. Like, we got to play every show like it's our last. We got to, you know, make these records that are built to last. We got to avoid the temptation to jump on trends. Yeah. And like, you know, because that stuff is always going to feel like the short-term solution. The temptation in the short term is always going to feel a lot more attractive than the longer game, the boring, you know, slow and steady. That's always a tough sell, especially when you're young and restless and you just want to like get laid and you just want to be cool. But like, it's like, dude, take the high road. Let's make records that are like, you know, not trying to be the best record of 2004. Let's make a record that is going to sound good in 2004, 2008, 2014, 2024, 2034. Let's make no matter how many records we get to make, let's make sure each one of them is, you know, built to last rather than just built to be trendy and cool for like, you know, or we were trying to, I mean, this sounds so pretentious, but like, let's approach these records as though we're making like, we're writing novels, not like we're writing magazine articles.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it, because, you know, you take more time and think about what you're going to say as opposed to just getting the work done. Right. It's like, you don't want to just get the homework to turn it in. You actually want to make sure that you're doing it the right way and then turn it in when it's actually done well.
Well, you know, especially when you're a rock and roll band, because, you know, whatever you want to call it, it's all rock and roll. You want to call it pop punk, you want to call it emo, you want to call it power pop, you want to call it alternative rock, indie rock, hard rock, you know, heavy metal, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same pizza with just different toppings. Okay. Yeah. It's three chords and something to say, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so we, as a band making a rock and roll record in the year 2001, it's in 2004, 2000, you know, this century, you're kind of standing on the shoulder of giants. You're kind of going, dude, the Beatles have already existed. The Clash has already existed. Nirvana has already existed. The Foo Fighters have already been around for like fucking 6 or 7 years. Yeah. Like Oasis already exists. You know, Green Day exists. Like why do we need to, if we're not going to, you know, Tom Petty already exists. Like, what are we doing? So, you know, it's like the attitude is like, you can either make this like sort of disposable music that's like sort of a single serving like thing, or you can try to like honor the legacy of like the records you love and go, dude, let's at least like try to make a record that's going to, you know, stand the test of time. And you never, I mean, you can't do that by design. All you can do is attempt to. And the beauty of being 20 years later, at least we have 20 years between us and our first record now, is you can look back on it and you kind of like hesitate. And you're like, oh God, I hope you don't know if you've achieved your goal until 10 or 20 years has gone by. And then you go back and listen to it and go, oh shit, this sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
This doesn't make me cringe
yourself
too badly.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's parts of Start Static where you're like, ooh, like we show our inexperience and our naivety, but that's also something beautiful because you know you could never make that record again.
Yeah. Because you try to polish it up and make it better, and it's like, why don't you just leave it as it is?
It would lose its charm and its character. Like part of the character of that record is it's got that like bratty first record. It's your handshake with the world, like, and that's kind of exciting. You can never make your first record twice, you know. Yeah. So, but that said, I feel like we approached each of our records with a brand new, each of our records had a new set of circumstances. With Start Static, we were a brand new band, getting signed for the first time, making the first record. The second record, Palm Trees and Power Lines, it had a different set of newness to it because we had a new drummer. We had Kenny Livingston that joined the band because Ben Davis had departed. And so having a new drummer is like having, I don't know, I guess this is a shitty analogy because I never had a heart transplant. But it's almost like having a new heart or having a new engine put in your car, or like maybe, you know, just that you're still you, but there's a different system in place.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, 100%.
You know, and it just, so even though it was still Sugarcult, still me, Tim, and Aaron and the band and our songs, like with Kenny in the band, it just, everything just like, I mean, drummers are so important. I feel bad for drummers because they don't usually do the interviews and they don't usually, you know, get recognized, picked out of a lineup. I mean, I remember Kenny would come out all covered in sweat because he was the hardest working guy in our band. And like some kids would come up to him and go, hey, when's the band coming out? And he'd be like, I mean, luckily, usually if you have the kind of ego that you want to, you're not going to choose drums because that's kind of more like you're hiding behind a bunch of equipment. Yeah. So you're going to be like if you're more of a peacock, you're going to be the lead singer or like a lead guitar player, or, you know. Yeah. You know, so it didn't hurt his ego because he's a pretty confident guy. But just, you know, drummers don't get enough credit, man. I mean, obviously there's certain drummers that are like frontmen, like Travis Barker or something. Yeah. But like drummers, you know, dude, I mean, I'll just say, like, drummers make or break a band. I mean, having Kenny in our band made us sound like grown-ups. Like, we're all a bunch of hacks, but Kenny was such a beast on the drums that it just like kicked us up into like we could go head to head with like anyone because he was that kind of drummer where it was just like he was a drummer's drummer, and it was just like having him in the band just turned us from like awkward teenagers into like grown men. You know what I mean? Like grown ass men. We went from awkward, insecure teenagers to grown ass men on palm trees and power lines. And then for Lights Out, so the new factor of Lights Out was like, we had a new label, the new home, you know, our record we'd gone from this label to that label, and then our things behind the scenes changed hands, and we ended up on this label called V2 Records. So it was the same label as the White Stripes and Rock and Terrors and a bunch of other big shit. You know, and like they had this huge engine, and they were just ready to just, you know, fuel inject. And like they were like, we will spare no expense. We'll go all systems go. You guys have proved yourselves. At that point, we had toured with Green Day on their American Idiot tour. We had toured Europe, playing arenas and stadiums, opening for Blink-182. We had done the main stage of the Warped Tour. Yeah, you know, where we're like one of the main bands coming out in the whole sea of people. You know, so at that point, we had this confidence where like the first record, we're like, we didn't know what was going to happen. We're just a local band from a small town by the beach. No idea, you know, if anyone's going to care. First record. And then we go out there and just play nonstop, 2 shows a day, 3 shows a day, whatever we had to do. Open for anybody who would, you know, play any place that has surface that we could, and an electrical outlet. So the first album was that. Second album was like, okay, we feel like we know how this works a little bit now. We feel more confident musically. We got a little bit more of a, you know, understanding of who our audience is and what to expect when we go out and play shows. We got a new drummer. That was the tone of Palm Trees and Power Lines, the memory. And then by the time we got to Lights Out, it was like, dude, we're ready to be the upperclassmen now. Like we felt like we were ready to like not apologize for our existence anymore and like start doing headlining shows, start doing just bigger, bolder moves. And then unfortunately things kind of just like fizzled out with our label, and we never fully recovered from that. But still, you know, it's a record people should listen to. Yeah, for sure. And during that time, you actually started a side project with one of your good friends, Joey Cape from Lagwagon, who you've known for years and years, in Bad Astronaut. Now, Bad Astronaut's actually one of my absolutely favorite bands of all time. You know, this was you, Joey, and Derek Plourde, who played in Lagwagon, also from the Ataris as well. But let's talk about this, because Bad Astronaut was also, it was like these guys from Santa Barbara who kind of were known for punk and punk bands that put together what I would consider very not punk albums at all. And it's just a rock / you know, it's more like maybe in the alternative genre, if you want to say that. But what was it like working with Joey and Derek in that band versus the other projects you've been in? And I know you obviously did like a re-release of that as well with a big box set. I mean, dude, see, I feel like, I mean, well, okay, so coming from Santa Barbara, like I said, it's kind of a small town. And Derek and I grew up in the same neighborhood, and we played in our first band ever when we were kids called Illiterate. We were like literally taught each other how to play music. We were just, you know, we had no idea what we were doing, just completely like, you know, flunking upwards, figuring it out as we went along, and just doing it for fun after school, you know. And then eventually that, you know, there's a whole long story there, but like, you know, eventually that spiraled into something that eventually kind of became Lagwagon. And so then Derek had a few years with Lagwagon, and then, you know, that eventually he departed Lagwagon, and he was having some problems. And so there was a few years that had gone by, and like Joey was always like the kind of cool older kid in the neighborhood. Well, he wasn't from our neighborhood, but in our town. Yeah. And like we knew each other. It's a very small town, Santa Barbara. Everyone who plays music knows each other, you know. So you had Lynn Straight from Snot, Joey from Lagwagon, you know, the Mad Caddies, Nerf Herder, all these bands in our little small town, Dishwalla, Ugly Kid Joe, Toe the Wet Sprocket, you know. No Effects lived there for a while. It's a very small town. Look it up on a map. Google it right now, and like you'll see like, oh shit, that's a pretty small place. You can get from one end of town to the other in like 15, 20 minutes. Yeah, I think the population is only something crazy, like 40,000 people or something. Yeah, totally. And there's like, you know, it's like this very like incestuous music community where we all kind of were either playing in bands together, dating the same girls, using the same equipment, going to each other's shows, going to the after parties, whatever it was. And then, so, you know, that's just sort of the spirit. No matter how much success any of us have had professionally, we still sort of carry that like small town kind of like scene of friends. Like it feels more like a family. Like I think of my friends from Santa Barbara, Chris Shiflett, who's the guitarist of the Foo Fighters now, you know, like we're all like kind of rock and roll family, you know?
Yeah.
And so we've always just like, you know, it's never been this like calculated business move. Like, hey, you know what we should do? We should start a side project because I think we can make a bunch of money. Just like purely for the joy of music, and even more than the joy of music, an excuse to hang out with friends. Like the same way a group of guys might get together and go fishing or go play golf, even if they're not depending on fishing to eat, or they're not professional golfers. You know, you just do it for the joy of doing it and getting together with your friends and spending time, you know? And so that's really what Bad Astronaut was. It was just Joey, Derek, and I realizing we missed playing music with each other, and we liked a lot of cool, diverse records. And we started to feel like a little bit, you know, like, oh man, our bands are kind of getting known for a certain sound. And there's these other sounds we want to explore. Let's do everybody a favor. Rather than having Lagwagon and Sugarcult start to like dabble in all these other styles of music, let's start a side project where we can sort of just have free reign to do whatever the hell we want. And just get together and drink some beers and see what happens. And that's really what happened with Bad Astronaut. It was like the spirit of just like get together with friends, make up some songs, and then just no rules at all. We can have slow songs, fast songs, long songs, short songs, you know, in the studio, make up songs as we go, like use different weird recording techniques. And, you know, Joey had a real big crush on like Radiohead's like Kid A and Amnesiac and all those kinds of, and like OK Computer and like this band Granddaddy we were listening to a lot. You know, there's just a lot of like Elliott Smith. There's a lot of things outside of what you would think we all liked based on our public personas or images, or what mostly ends up being what critics say about you, you know? And like, so we just had this chance to kind of it's just a playground, just go in the studio. And honestly, Orange Whip was owned by a guy named Angus Cook, who plays electric cello. So we were recording in his studio. We're like, well, dude, why don't you just join the band? So be our cello player. And the other guy who worked there was this guy, Tom Flowers, who is an amazing guitar player and producer and mixer. And so we're like, why don't you be the guitar player? And then, you know, it was just kind of like, who else? Anyone who's going to walk in the room is going to end up in this band.
Yeah,
you know,
doing
why not? We're not a real band.
We're
not gonna do like, yeah, exactly. So you could have been in the band too. And I mean, honestly, if you listen to some of the records, you hear like these voices, like these little, like, you hear someone like counting at the beginning of, I think it's at the beginning of the 12 Small Steps record.
Yep.
And that's
1,
like
2, 3, 4.
Yeah, that's my wife now, who was my girlfriend at the time. Like we just brought her in. They're like, hey, come here, count to 9 a bunch of times, and then we'll chop it up. Another one, you hear like you hear some like a guy and a girl talking to each other. That was literally like the two like college kid interns at the recording studio were like, hey Pete, hey Alyssa, get over here, say this on the microphone. You know, like it was just that kind of spirit. Like there was really some of the weird outros you hear that sound all phasey and weird. That's literally because we were at rehearsal and like improvising and like had one of these old school like tape recorders, and we would like record our rehearsal in case we came up with any good ideas. And then what we did was we just put this in there, pushed play, and put a microphone up to it, and literally put that on the record. Yeah. So instead of recreating it in the studio, we just like recorded off of a shitty little like tape. And like, just, I remember Joey went to Radio Shack at the time. Radio Shack still existed. And he spent like, you know, $200 on just the cheapest microphones they had. Like the shittiest microphones Radio Shack had, like little dictating machines that like, you know, lawyers use for like, you know, those things that you do, or like old 80s answering machines, like just anything that had a shitty microphone in it. Exactly. Just like the shittier the mic, the better. And he just bought them all and brought them in there and like put them on a table and plugged them in and recorded the drums with those microphones.
That's crazy.
So you had that, and you had the fancy microphones. So you had that to mix in. So you had this like microphones that were like distorting and like, you know, with like really nice fancy microphones. That mentality, that sort of like Sgt. Pepper's, Pet Sounds, OK Computer, that using the studio as an instrument, you know, was, and I don't think, you know, I think we got it right, maybe, you know, 6 out of 10 times, but you know,
well, I guess literally every one of the albums is fantastic. I've listened to them probably 300 to 500 times each. And
oh man,
you know,
thank you.
It's I think when you put minds together, like your guys' minds, and just let all the barriers wipe away, you don't get the same record that you've ever heard before. And as soon as I heard Acrophobe the first time, I was like, well, what the holy shit is this? This is amazing. And then the second one came out, obviously, Houston, we have a drinking problem. And I was like, this is fucking even better. Like, it's taken it up a notch. And then obviously Derek passed away while doing some of the recording for the third album, for 12 Small Steps, One Giant Disappointment. But I do want to touch on that, because obviously
don't forget the split EP we did with Armchair Martian too.
Yeah.
Where they covered our songs and we covered their songs. Yep. That's getting re-released this year too. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say that, but it is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Breaking news, I guess. Huh?
But yeah, so I mean, there's a weird, like, sometimes I feel like I have this, like, you know, like this identity crisis where it's like, are you the guy from Sugarcult, or are you the guy from Bad Astronaut? Are you the guy from Santa Barbara? Are you the guy from LA? It's like, I guess the moral of the story is, you don't have to, you know, it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to check one box, you know. And I just kind of, like, if anything, I hope our bands serve as an example to anybody out there who wants to play music. It's like, dude, you know, give yourself permission to just be an artist and not feel like you have to, like I love that line by the song Boxcar by one of my favorite bands, Jawbreaker. They say, like, I'm coloring outside your guidelines. I was passing out while you were passing out the rules. 1, 2, 3, 4. Who's punk? What's the score? It's just, it's like, give me rules. Or Picasso, his quote, you know, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. Don't just learn the rules. Learn them so you know where the guidelines are, and then fucking color outside of the guidelines. Like, you don't have to be, you know, you don't have to be a punk band the same way someone else is a punk band. Yeah. You know, to me, Sugarcult was very punk rock in spirit, but we were never punk rock by design. We never sat down and had at a boardroom table and said, let's be a punk band. You know, you be the guy that does this kind of a jump. I'll be the guy that wears the Hurley t-shirt, and you be the guy that wears the Atticus t-shirt. It was just never that conversation. It was just, let's be a rock and roll band. Hey, turns out the songs people like by our people like the song Bouncing Off the Walls. It's kind of punky, I guess. You know? So then people start calling you a punk band. You're like, well, what about Lost in You? And I changed my name. Like, let's just not talk about those right now. You know? What about
those are the experimental tracks.
It's just like, you know, I don't know. I know people in all of those bands. You know, we're friends with all these bands. The Used, we're great friends with them, and Good Charlotte, and Jimmy Eat World, and we've toured and become friends with so many of these bands. Motion City Soundtrack. The last thing any of those bands are talking about is, you know, whatever kind of box the culture has put them in. You know, you talk to oh my God, like the bass player from Good Charlotte will turn you on to like Thundercat and the most crazy fucking neo jazz. You know, the dude from Motion City Soundtrack is all about like crazy 90s shit, like Superchunk and Archers of Loaf and like Poster Children and all those kinds of, you know, the last thing he's talking about is like, you know, All American Rejects and Fall Out Boy. Although those bands are rad too. And you talk to those guys, like you talk to the guy in All American Rejects, all he wants to talk about is Def Leppard. You know, you talk to the guy in Fall Out Boy, all he wants to talk about is Iron Maiden. It's like, it's not what you think, you know? Yeah. I've even talked to the guy, I've talked to James Hetfield from Metallica, and all he wanted to talk about was James Taylor. Like he wanted to talk about like 70s singer-songwriters.
Folk musicians and stuff.
Yeah, you don't have to be so tribal and like, I like fat records, so therefore I only like music that goes, you know, or I like pop punk, so I has to be Newfound Glory or something. It's like, dude, just love music. It's like, do you love music or do you love like, and I get it. People want to feel like they belong to something, you know?
That's why they all dress the same way. And you go, why are you dressed exactly like the other person, but you're not a conformist?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Different, just like everybody else. But like, you know, it's just, anyway, you don't get carried away with all that stuff. But, you know, the bottom line is like, I look at it like, what the hell does Sugarcult and Bad Astronaut have in common other than the fact that I'm in both of those bands and they're both from Santa Barbara? And I go, you know what? Both of those bands went into it with a very humble mission to just make the songs as good as they can be and have fun with friends, you know? And if you do it with that way, I feel like it's a labor of love and then somehow it becomes kind of attractive and sexy, and other people somehow are drawn to it. And I feel like people can tell. That's the other thing. When I hear someone like you, like, you're serious enough about music to have your own podcast about it and do all these kinds of things, it's like, and you care about Bad Astronaut, makes me feel like it worked. Because I'm like, dude, if you do something and you put in that sort of secret ingredient, like you do it with as a labor of love with your friends, just because, not with any sort of like end game strategy sort of thing that you're trying to do. I mean, of course we want to be successful. We want people to hear the music, but it isn't like, how do we get rich? How do we get famous? How do we get included in the cool new trend that's currently on the cover of the magazine? As long as you remove those kind of things and you just do it for the I don't want to say the right reasons, because the right reasons are, I mean, if you're someone who's broke and you need to make money, the right reason to do it is to make money. So that's not the wrong reason, but like, it's like, if you just do it sort of without trying so fucking hard, sometimes it turns out okay. And sometimes it turns out more than okay. Sometimes you end up hearing your song on the radio and getting like big checks in the mail and going, oh shit, that's awesome, you know? And sometimes you end up having people like, you know, want to buy it on vinyl 10 years later in a box set. And it's like, I look at some of these songs and I'm like, oh my God, it's so crazy that people take that song so seriously. Like, we were literally like hysterically laughing in a room, like seeing how far we could push it and like trying so hard and failing so hard to imitate something that we thought was cool by another band. You know what I mean? But that's how it works, I guess. And I'm sure those bands are the same thing. Best thing I can tell you guys to do if you want to learn what it's like to be in a band, watch that movie that's on Disney Plus right now called Get Back, which is like the Peter Jackson guy who did the Lord of the Rings movie. He got the footage of the Beatles making their last album, Let It Be. Dude, we all want to think that at least the Beatles of all bands are immune to the things that happen to every band. And then you watch that and it's so humbling, because you're like, oh, they're just like every other fucking band in the world.
Even the greatest band of all time still didn't have their shit together all the time.
Two guys trying to be the leader, one guy kind of begrudgingly being the benevolent dictator, while the other guy would be, but he's too chaotic and erratic. And then the other guy who is equally brilliant, but just doesn't have the self-confidence to be the leader. And then the other guy that just is the smartest guy in the band, probably, who just shuts the fuck up and just waits for everybody. And that's Ringo. You know what I mean? And I'm like, every band I've ever been in is exactly that, except for the only difference is we aren't at the end of the day, we're not writing Let It Be.
For sure. So that concludes part 1 of our 2-part conversation with the certifiable rock historian, Marko DeSantis. Make sure to check out part 2 of this episode, which will play right after this, to hear even more great insights about what it's like to watch Marko's lifelong friend get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and so much more. If you like what you heard on the show, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends on social media. You can see the full video interview on our YouTube channel as well. Also, if you want to check out some of our written content or any of the products or merch that we have available, go to poweredbyrock.com to read our absolutely free rockin' blog full of album reviews, interviews, and lists to keep you entertained. And find our gear as well so you can pick up some items to play and look like a rock legend. We'll see you soon for the next episode. Until then, rock on.